The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Dairy Queen parking lot as Sarah Chen gripped the edge of her wooden counter, her knuckles turning white. The man towering before her adjusted his crisp charcoal suit, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes fixed firmly on his face. Behind him, two other men in similar attire stood blocking the entrance, their presence turning the familiar space of her family's restaurant into something foreign and threatening. "Miss Chen, let's be reasonable," Marcus Sterling said, sliding another document across the counter. $5 million is more than generous for a franchise this size in a town like River Grove. You could retire tomorrow, start fresh anywhere you want. His manicured finger tapped the signature line. All it takes is one signature. Sarah's gaze drifted to the wall behind the counter, where a faded photograph hung slightly crooked, her parents on opening day 30 years ago, their proud smiles radiating hope and determination. Her father's heavy accent echoing in her memory, "Remember, May, success not just about money. It's about serving people, making community." "Mr. Sterling," Sarah's voice was quiet but firm, "I've already told you no. 3 times now. This location isn't just a business to me or this town. My answer won't change, no matter how many times you ask or how many suits you bring with you." Sterling's smile tightened. "Miss Chen, perhaps you don't understand the reality of your situation. Progress is coming to River Grove whether you like it or not. Sterling Development has already acquired most of the properties along Main Street. This sad little ice cream shop is becoming an inconvenience." The bell above the door chimed as elderly Mrs. Patterson shuffled in, her granddaughter Emma skipping beside her. They'd come every Wednesday at 4:30 for the past 8 years, butter pecan for Mrs. Patterson, chocolate dip cone for Emma. The sight of the men in suits made them pause uncertainly. "We're open," Sarah called out warmly, stepping around the counter. "Emma, I saved some extra sprinkles just for you today." Sterling's hand caught her arm. "We're not finished here." The touch sent a jolt through Sarah's body. In that moment, something shifted inside her, a lifetime of her parents' gentle teachings about respect and harmony colliding with the realization that some things were worth fighting for. Probably just a raccoon, she told herself, picking up her pace. But the hair on the back of her neck stood up, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As she drove home, Sarah's mind raced. She needed to research Sterling Development, reach out to other business owners, maybe contact the local paper. But first, she needed to understand why they wanted this specific location so badly. $5 million for a Dairy Queen in a small town wasn't just generous, it was suspicious. The next morning, Sarah arrived early to prep for the day. As she turned into the parking lot, her heart stopped. The windows were intact, but the building's white exterior was covered in angry red graffiti, "Sell out" and "Progress is coming." Sarah sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel, tears threatening to spill. A knock on her window made her jump. It was Carlos from the Mexican restaurant 2 doors down, concern etched on his weathered face. "I saw it on my morning walk," he said as she stepped out. "Already called my nephew, he does painting. We'll have this cleaned up before you open." "Carlos, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. They came to me last week too. Offered $3 million. But my father built this restaurant. My children grew up here. Some things mean more than money, yes." Sarah hugged the older man, fighting back tears. As they stood there, more people began to arrive, regulars who'd seen the graffiti while driving past, high school students who worked part-time at neighboring businesses, even Tom Mason himself, looking guilty but determined to help. Within 2 hours, the graffiti was gone. Someone had made a coffee run. Others brought breakfast. The morning had become an impromptu community gathering, with people sharing their own stories of pressure from Sterling Development. Sarah listened, pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place. Sterling wasn't just buying properties, they were systematically dismantling the heart of River Grove. But why? And more importantly, how could she stop them? As she unlocked the front door to start the day, Sarah's phone buzzed with another text from her brother, called in some favors. Found interesting info about Sterling's other developments. We need to talk. Sarah smiled for the first time in days. The war for River Grove was just beginning, but at least now she knew she wasn't fighting alone. Looking at her parents' photo on the wall, Sarah whispered, "Don't worry. I won't let them take what you built. Some things really are worth fighting for." The morning rush began, and Sarah took her place behind the counter, serving ice cream with the same care and attention her parents had taught her. But now, each cone felt like an act of defiance, each smile exchanged with a customer a small victory in a larger battle. Sterling Development had no idea what they were up against. They saw a small-town Dairy Queen franchise. Sarah saw a community worth preserving, a legacy worth protecting, and a future worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The musty smell of old paper filled Sarah's nostrils as she pulled another box from her parents' storage unit. Moonlight filtered through the facility's dusty windows, casting strange shadows across towers of cardboard containers. Her brother Michael stood nearby, his suit jacket discarded, tie loosened, scrolling through documents on his tablet. Mom and Dad kept everything, Sarah muttered, lifting out yellowed newspapers and faded receipts. But why here? Why not at home? Michael looked up, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. Because they knew someday we'd need proof. Look at this. He handed her the tablet, showing a news article from 25 years ago. Sterling Development isn't just interested in our Dairy Queen. They're after what's underneath it. Sarah's eyes widened as she read. In 1998, geologists had discovered a massive underground aquifer beneath River Grove, one of the largest freshwater reserves in the state. But the discovery had been quietly buried, the report sealed under mysterious circumstances. Keep reading, Michael urged. Notice who was mayor back then? Marcus Sterling Sr., Sarah breathed. Current Sterling's father. The same man who rezoned that entire section of town for commercial use right before leaving office. Michael pulled out more documents. And now his son returns, buying up every property along Main Street. They're not building a strip mall, Sarah. They're after water rights. A sharp metallic clang echoed through the storage facility, making them both jump. Sarah's heart raced as footsteps echoed down the concrete corridor outside. Michael quickly switched off his tablet, plunging them into darkness. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped. A beam of light swept past their unit's door. Sarah held her breath, remembering Sterling's threatening text messages. After what felt like eternity, the footsteps retreated. "Security guard," Michael whispered, but he didn't sound convinced. "We should go. It's not safe here." They gathered the most important documents, loading them into Sarah's car. As they pulled out of the storage facility, Sarah noticed a black SUV idling in the shadows. It pulled out behind them. "We're being followed," she said, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Michael checked the rearview mirror. "Take the back roads. Let's see if they're really following us." Sarah turned down increasingly narrow streets, the SUV maintaining its distance but never falling behind. Her mind raced back to childhood memories, endless summer days helping at the Dairy Queen, watching her parents serve free ice cream to kids whose families couldn't afford it. "They always said location was everything," Sarah murmured. "I thought they meant the foot traffic, being near the high school. But they chose that spot specifically, didn't they? They were protecting something bigger." Michael nodded grimly. Mom and Dad were activists in China before they fled. They recognized corruption when they saw it. They didn't just build a business, Sarah. They built a blockade. The SUV behind them suddenly accelerated, its headlights flooding their car. Sarah swerved onto a side street, tires screeching. The vehicle pursued, closing the gap. "Call the police," Sarah shouted, taking a sharp turn onto River Road, the old industrial route that paralleled the town's namesake waterway. But before Michael could dial, the SUV dropped back and turned off, disappearing into the night as suddenly as it had appeared. They'd been sent a message, "We're watching." The next morning, Sarah unlocked the Dairy Queen with trembling hands. Her phone had been buzzing all night with texts from concerned neighbors. Someone had gone to every business on Main Street, sliding ominous notices under doors: "Final notice. Accept Sterling Development's offer or face immediate legal action." Carlos from the Mexican restaurant was waiting by the door. "They're saying they'll report health code violations, tax irregularities. They're threatening our licenses, our livelihoods." "They can't do that," Sarah said, but uncertainty crept into her voice. Sterling Development had deep pockets and deeper political connections. The morning passed in a blur of customers and whispered conversations. Many locals had already heard about the threatening notices. Some offered support, others advised caution. A few suggested she was foolish to resist. Around noon, an elderly man Sarah had never seen before shuffled in. He ordered a simple vanilla cone, then lingered at the counter. "You're James Chen's daughter," he said finally. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, studying his weathered face. "I worked for the city planning department back then," he continued quietly. "Your father, he knew what was at stake. The aquifer isn't just water, it's the last pure source in 3 counties. Sterling wants to privatize it, sell it off to the highest bidder. But your father, he made me promise to give you this if they ever came back." He pressed a worn envelope into her hand, then turned and walked out before she could respond. Inside was a single key and a handwritten note in her father's precise characters, below the old freezer. "Trust only family." Sarah's hands shook as she read the note again. The old freezer, the massive unit that had died years ago but her father had insisted on keeping in the back room, claiming it would be too expensive to remove. That night, after closing, Sarah and Michael moved boxes and supplies away from the ancient freezer. Behind it, hidden by decades of storage, they found a small door set into the wall, its lock green with age. The key turned with difficulty. The door opened to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Dad's secret," Sarah whispered. "He left us proof." They descended carefully, flashlight beams revealing a small concrete room lined with filing cabinets. On a dusty desk sat a single manila envelope marked "Sterling" in their father's handwriting. As they opened it, Sarah's phone buzzed. Another message from Sterling Development: "Tomorrow. 9 a.m. Final offer." Michael picked up one of the documents, his eyes widening. "Sarah, this is bigger than we thought. These aren't just about the aquifer. There's evidence of environmental violations, payoffs, falsified reports spanning decades." "Then we have leverage," Sarah said, her voice strengthening with resolve. "We have a target on our backs," Michael corrected. "Sterling won't just walk away. Not with this much at stake." Sarah thought of her parents, of their quiet strength and unwavering principles. She thought of River Grove, of Mrs. Patterson and Emma, of Carlos, and all the other small business owners facing intimidation. "Tomorrow morning," she said, gathering the documents, "we show Sterling Development exactly what they're up against. Mom and Dad didn't just leave us a business, they left us a mission." As they climbed back upstairs, Sarah paused in the familiar comfort of her family's restaurant. The truth about her parents' legacy was still sinking in. They hadn't just been small business owners, they'd been guardians of something precious, choosing this location deliberately to prevent powerful men from exploiting a vital resource. Now that duty had passed to her. Tomorrow would change everything, for her, for Sterling Development, and for the future of River Grove itself. Sarah Chen, daughter of immigrants, purveyor of ice cream cones and summer memories, was about to become something else entirely, a warrior for her community's future. The old Dairy Queen sign hummed softly in the darkness, its blue glow a beacon of resistance against the encroaching shadows of greed and corruption. Sarah locked up for the night, knowing that whatever happened tomorrow, nothing would ever be the same again.
Development's plans for the aquifer. The cramped room was split down the middle, quite literally, with Sterling's supporters on one side and those backing Sarah on the other. "You're destroying our chance at prosperity," shouted Frank Wilson, the local real estate agent, his face red with anger. "Sterling Development is offering jobs, growth, a future for our kids. By selling our water rights to the highest bidder?" Carlos countered, standing beside Sarah. "By destroying businesses that have served this community for generations?" Mayor Thompson, looking increasingly uncomfortable at the podium, tried to maintain order. "Please, everyone. We need to discuss this civilly. There's nothing civil about what Sterling's doing." This from Mrs. Patterson, who had never raised her voice in the 30 years Sarah had known her. "They're threatening people, vandalizing properties. My own grandson lost his job at Mason Hardware when they forced Tom to sell." Tom Mason himself sat in the back, staring at his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Sarah stood, hands trembling slightly as she held up the documents from her father's hidden room. These records show a pattern of corruption dating back decades. Sterling Development has been planning this water grab since before most of us were born. They've suppressed environmental studies, bribed officials. Alleged corruption, interrupted a smooth voice from the doorway. Marcus Sterling strode in, flanked by his usual suits and a woman Sarah recognized as Catherine Wells, the state's most prominent corporate attorney. "Miss Chen is making serious accusations without context. The documents she claims to have were obtained illegally, and I'm afraid we'll have to take legal action." A murmur ran through the crowd. Sarah felt her brother Michael tense beside her. "Nothing illegal about keeping records of public meetings," Michael shot back. "Our father attended every city council session for 20 years. He documented everything." "Your father," Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension, "was a simple ice cream vendor who didn't understand progress. Just like his daughter." The room erupted again, but Sarah barely heard it. Her mind flashed to a memory, her father, teaching her to maintain the soft-serve machine, speaking quietly about importance. "Everyone thinks small business just about money, May. But sometimes, small business is where big changes start. Sometimes, staying small is how you fight big wrongs."
She understood now. Every free ice cream cone, every late payment accepted with a smile, every community event hosted in their parking lot, it had all been building a foundation of trust and connection that Sterling's millions couldn't buy. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah's voice cut through the chaos, steady and clear. "You call my father simple because he served ice cream. But he and my mother chose that location knowing what lay beneath it. They spent 30 years building relationships while you were building shell companies to hide your water rights acquisitions. So tell me, which of us really doesn't understand progress?" Sterling's practiced smile faltered for a moment. Catherine Wells whispered something in his ear. But the meeting's dynamic had already shifted. People were pulling out phones, recording, sharing the documents Sarah had brought. Local reporters who had been dozing through what they expected to be a routine town hall were suddenly alert, scribbling frantically. "This is bigger than just River Grove," called out Dr. Rodriguez, the town's environmental science teacher. "If Sterling gets control of the aquifer, they could sell our water rights to anyone. Look what happened in Parker County when they tried this, whole communities left without accessible water while corporations bottled and sold it elsewhere." The crowd's mood shifted again, fear replacing anger. Sarah watched faces change as people realized what was really at stake. Sterling raised his hands placatingly. "We're offering jobs, development, growth. Ms. Chen is offering conspiracy theories and outdated documents. Ask yourselves, what's worth more to River Grove's future?" "The truth," came a quiet voice. Everyone turned. Tom Mason had stood up, his weathered face lined with resolve. I sold because they threatened to reveal my daughter's medical debt, say I'd been embezzling to pay for her treatments. But Sarah's right. Some things matter more than money. Count me as a witness to their threats. Others began standing, the owner of the flower shop, the barber, the local insurance agent. Each had a story of threats, of pressure, of discovering too late what they'd really signed away. Sterling's face hardened. Ms. Wells, I believe we're done here. File the injunctions first thing tomorrow. Already done, the lawyer replied, not bothering to lower her voice. The restraining orders too. By tomorrow, Ms. Chen won't be able to discuss any of this publicly. But Sarah wasn't finished. She nodded to Michael, who clicked a button on his laptop. The community center's projector hummed to life, displaying a live stream that had been running since the meeting began. The view counter showed over 10,000 viewers. The internet is forever, Mr. Sterling, Sarah said quietly. Just like community bonds. Sterling's exit was less smooth than his entrance. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The battle lines had been drawn, and River Grove would never be the same. That night, after most people had left, Sarah sat alone in the community center, reading messages of support pouring in from across the state. But there were threats too, and worried warnings. Sterling Development had destroyed other communities that tried to resist. Her phone buzzed, another message from an unknown number. But this one was different, meeting tomorrow, midnight. Loading dock behind the old cannery. Bring the documents. You're not the only town Sterling's trying to destroy. Sarah stared at the message for a long time, wondering if it was a trap. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by the occasional drip of water. Somewhere in the darkness, decisions were being made, legal papers filed, plans set in motion. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and injunctions, threats and counter-threats. But tonight, Sarah finally understood why her parents had chosen this path, this town, this simple ice cream shop that had become a fortress protecting something precious. She typed a reply to the mysterious message, I'll be there. Because some fights are bigger than just one town. The empty community center felt like a battlefield after the skirmish, chairs askew, papers scattered, the air still thick with tension. But as Sarah gathered her things to leave, she noticed something that gave her hope. People had automatically separated their recycling, stacked the chairs, cleaned up their spaces. Small acts of community care, ingrained habits of people who looked out for each other. Sterling Development had money, power, and political connections. But River Grove had something stronger, a community worth fighting for, and a truth that couldn't be buried again. The old cannery loomed against the midnight sky, its abandoned silhouette a stark reminder of River Grove's industrial past. Sarah pulled her car into the shadows, killing the engine but leaving the key in the ignition. Michael's warnings echoed in her mind, it's probably a trap. But the USB drive in her pocket, containing copies of her father's documents, felt like it was burning a hole through her jacket. Movement caught her eye, a figure emerging from behind a rusted shipping container. Sarah's hand tightened on her phone, 911 already pre-dialed. But then the figure stepped into a shaft of moonlight, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Janet Sterling, she whispered, recognizing Marcus Sterling's estranged wife, who'd vanished from River Grove's social scene 3 years ago. You're brave to come, Janet said, approaching Sarah's car. But then, James Chen's daughter would have to be brave. She glanced nervously over her shoulder. We don't have much time. They're watching both of us. Sarah stepped out of the car, keeping the door open. Why are you helping me? Because Marcus isn't just destroying River Grove. He's poisoning every community where Sterling Development operates. Janet pulled out a tablet. Remember the Parker County situation Dr. Rodriguez mentioned? That was just the beginning. Look at this. The tablet showed a map dotted with red markers across 3 states. Each marker represented a Sterling development project, and each project centered on a crucial water source. But it was the document behind the map that made Sarah's blood run cold, a corporate strategy outlining Operation Watershed. "They're creating a private water empire," Janet explained, her voice trembling. "Buying up access points to every major aquifer in the region. Once they control the sources, they'll control everything: agriculture, industry, basic utilities. They've already started in other towns, raising rates until people can't afford to stay, forcing them to sell their homes and businesses." "That's why you left him," Sarah realized. Janet's laugh was bitter. "I tried to fight it from the inside first. Gathered evidence, made copies of everything. But Marcus found out. He had me committed to a private mental health facility for exhaustion. By the time I got out, he'd frozen my accounts, taken everything. I've been gathering allies ever since, waiting for someone to take a public stand." A distant dog's bark made them both jump. Janet quickly handed Sarah a small hard drive. "Everything I collected is here: financial records, emails, internal memos. But be careful. The law firm they use, Wells and Associates, they don't just file lawsuits. They destroy lives." As if on cue, Sarah's phone buzzed with an email from Catherine Wells. The subject line read, "Notice of emergency injunction, immediate response required." "They're moving faster than we expected," Janet said, reading over Sarah's shoulder. "Marcus must be worried." She stopped suddenly, her eyes widening at something behind Sarah. "Run!" Headlights flooded the loading dock as 2 black SUVs roared around the corner. Sarah bolted for her car, but stopped when she heard Janet cry out. 2 men had emerged from the shadows, grabbing the older woman. "Go!" Janet shouted. "The evidence is what matters." Sarah's instincts screamed at her to help, but she knew Janet was right. She threw herself into her car just as the SUVs screeched to a halt. Tires spinning on loose gravel, she accelerated past them, catching a glimpse of Marcus Sterling himself stepping out of one vehicle, his face contorted with rage. Her rearview mirror showed the SUVs in pursuit. Sarah's hands shook on the steering wheel as she navigated River Grove's empty streets, taking sharp turns through neighborhoods she'd known since childhood. Her phone kept buzzing, likely more legal threats, but she couldn't spare a glance. She couldn't go home, they'd be watching it. The Dairy Queen was probably under surveillance too. But there was one place they wouldn't know about, one refuge her parents had prepared for just such an emergency. Sarah swerved onto Old Mill Road, the SUVs still in pursuit. The abandoned paper mill's gates were chained shut, but she knew about the gap in the fence behind the loading bays, a childhood secret from days spent exploring with Michael. Her small car barely squeezed through, but the SUVs would have to find another way around. Inside the mill's cavernous interior, Sarah killed her lights and engine, heart pounding as the SUV's headlights swept past outside. Her phone showed 15 missed calls and a barrage of texts, some from Michael, others from unknown numbers alternating between threats and offers of money. When she was sure the SUVs had gone, Sarah opened Janet's hard drive on her laptop. File after file detailed Sterling Development's operations, shell companies, fake environmental reports, bribes to local officials. But it was an email thread from 3 days ago that made her gasp. The emails discussed, containing, the River Grove situation. Options included fabricated health code violations, tax fraud allegations, and, Sarah's blood ran cold, permanent solutions, if necessary. The recipients included not just Sterling executives, but local officials, state regulators, even a federal judge. This was bigger than her family's Dairy Queen now. Bigger than River Grove. Sterling Development wasn't just a corrupt corporation, it was a criminal enterprise with tentacles reaching into every level of government. Her phone buzzed again, Michael. This time she answered. Where are you? He demanded. Sterling's people are everywhere. They just posted armed guards outside the Dairy Queen. I'm safe, Sarah assured him. But Michael, you need to see what I just found. Sterling's not just after our water. There. The call died. No signal. Sarah looked up to see flashlight beams playing across the mill's broken windows. Voices echoed outside, boots crunching on gravel. She quickly packed her laptop, looking for another exit. The mill had been her childhood playground, she knew its secrets. The old maintenance tunnels could lead her to the river's edge. But first, Sarah pulled out her phone, using the last of its battery to upload Janet's files to multiple secure locations. Then she composed a single email to every news outlet in the state: Sterling Development's Operation Watershed, the truth about your water's future. As she pressed send, the mill side door crashed open. Sarah slipped into the shadows, making her way toward the hidden tunnel entrance. Behind her, voices echoed off the ancient machines. Find her. Mr. Sterling wants those files. In the darkness, Sarah smiled grimly. They didn't realize it was already too late. The truth was out there now, spreading across the internet, impossible to contain. Just like the water they sought to control. The tunnel was exactly as she remembered, though tighter now than when she was 12. As she crawled through decades of dust and cobwebs, Sarah thought about Janet Sterling, about Tom Mason, about all the people Sterling Development had tried to silence. Her father's voice echoed in her memory: sometimes biggest changes start smallest places. He'd meant the Dairy Queen, but maybe he'd also meant moments like this: one person refusing to be silenced, refusing to look away from injustice. When she emerged on the riverbank, the night was starting to fade. Dawn would bring new threats, new challenges. Sterling Development would strike back hard, using every weapon in their considerable arsenal. But Sarah wasn't alone anymore. The truth was out there, spreading like ripples across a pond. And somewhere in River Grove, a small ice cream shop stood as a symbol of resistance, its foundation anchored in something stronger than concrete: the power of community, truth, and unwavering determination to fight for what's right. The sun set over the small town, casting long shadows across the Dairy Queen parking lot. Jack Peterson stood in the doorway of his store, surveying the damage with a heavy heart. The once pristine white walls were now smeared with crude graffiti. Words like bigot and hate were spray-painted in angry red letters, standing stark against the backdrop of his store's cheerful logo. Broken glass crunched under his boots as he stepped outside to take it all in. The sign, the center of the controversy, had been torn down and shattered into pieces on the ground. Jack bent down and picked up one jagged fragment, his hand trembling. He turned it over, the words barely visible through the cracks. It was the part that read, "Courage means standing firm." Jack clenched his jaw. He wasn't angry, not in the way most people would have expected. Instead, he felt an overwhelming sadness, not just for his business, but for the town he had always called home. He looked at the crowd gathered at the edge of the lot, a mix of supporters, protesters, and curious onlookers drawn by the flashing lights of the police cars now lining the street. Emma stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face pale but determined. A local news reporter approached Jack, microphone in hand, camera crew trailing close behind. "Mr. Peterson, how do you feel about this act of vandalism? Do you regret putting up the sign now that it's caused such division?" Jack straightened up, holding the broken piece of the sign in his hand. He looked directly into the camera, his voice steady. "Regret? No, I don't regret standing by my beliefs. But I do regret that our town has come to this point, where people feel the need to destroy instead of talk. This isn't about a sign anymore, it's about who we are as a community." The reporter pressed on, but Jack raised a hand, signaling that he had said enough. He turned to Emma, who had been silent throughout the ordeal. "We're not going to fight fire with fire," he said quietly. "But we're not backing down either. It's time to try something different." Emma gave him a puzzled look but nodded. "What do you have in mind?" The next morning, Jack posted a notice on the Dairy Queen social media page and taped a printed version to the shattered window. It was an invitation for a town hall meeting, to be held in the parking lot of the store that evening. "Let's talk," the message read. "No shouting, no insults, just a conversation about who we are and where we go from here." As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, people began to gather in the Dairy Queen parking lot. Folding chairs appeared, borrowed from churches and schools. Some people brought blankets and sat on the grass near the edge of the lot. The crowd was a strange mix of faces. Those who had been vocal critics of Jack's sign stood shoulder to shoulder with his most ardent supporters. Jack stepped up onto a makeshift stage, a wooden pallet borrowed from the store's backroom. A single microphone, wired to a small speaker, crackled to life as he cleared his throat. The murmuring crowd fell silent. "I know most of you are here because of the sign," Jack began, his voice carrying across the lot. "And I know a lot of you don't agree with what I wrote on it. Some of you are angry. Some of you are hurt. And some of you," he paused, scanning the crowd, "think I'm a stubborn old fool who doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the crowd, breaking some of the tension. "But here's the thing," Jack continued. "That sign wasn't just words to me. It was a reminder of my wife, Sarah, and the way she lived her life. She believed in speaking her truth, even when it wasn't popular. She believed that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about standing firm in what you believe, even when it's hard. And let me tell you, it's been hard these past few weeks." Jack's voice wavered slightly, and he took a deep breath to steady himself. "I'm not here to change anyone's mind. I'm here to listen. I want to hear from you, why the sign upset you, why it inspired you, why it mattered to you. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about me or my store. It's about us, as a community." For a moment, there was silence. Then, a woman in the back raised her hand. She was one of the protesters who had been most vocal against Jack. She stepped forward hesitantly, holding a piece of paper. "I disagree with you, Mr. Peterson," she began. "But I respect that you're willing to hear us out. That's more than most people would do these days." She went on to share her perspective, explaining why the sign felt exclusionary to her and others. Jack listened intently, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When she finished, a man stepped forward from the other side of the crowd, his voice passionate as he defended Jack's right to free speech. The conversation that followed was raw, emotional, and at times heated. But something remarkable happened as the evening wore on. People began to listen to each other, not just to respond, but to understand. Stories were shared, tears were shed, and slowly, the walls between opposing sides began to crumble. Near the end of the evening, Jack stepped back onto the stage, his face tired but hopeful. "Tonight, I've heard things that challenged me, things that moved me, and things that made me think. And that's what this is all about, not agreeing on everything, but finding a way to move forward together." As the crowd began to disperse, Emma approached Jack, her eyes shining with pride. "I think Mom would have been proud of you tonight," she said softly. Jack smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I hope so, kiddo. I really do." The next morning, Jack arrived at the store to find a group of volunteers waiting for him. The weeks that followed the town hall meeting were unlike anything Jack Peterson had ever experienced. His small Dairy Queen, once just a place for families to grab ice cream or burgers, had become the center of a much larger story. People from across the state, and even further, were stopping by. Some came to shake Jack's hand and thank him for standing by his convictions. Others came with questions, curious about how such a small-town controversy had managed to spark such a meaningful conversation. But with the attention came a fresh wave of challenges. Online, the story had taken on a life of its own. Social media posts, news articles, and opinion pieces swirled around the internet, each offering a different take on Jack's actions and the town's response. Some painted Jack as a hero for free speech and small-town values, while others labeled him as stubborn and out of touch. The polarized reactions weren't surprising, but they were exhausting. Jack tried to stay grounded, focusing on his work at the Dairy Queen and the community he had always cared so deeply about. Yet, even as he greeted customers and flipped burgers, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still unresolved. He had started a conversation, yes, but what now? How could the community move forward in a way that truly reflected the spirit of the town he loved? One evening, after closing up the store, Jack sat at the counter with Emma. The two shared a quiet moment, sipping coffee and reflecting on everything that had happened. "Dad," Emma said finally, breaking the silence. "Do you ever wonder if it was worth it? All of this, the sign, the town hall, the attention. Do you think it actually changed anything?" Jack set his coffee mug down, his brow furrowed in thought. "I've been asking myself the same thing," he admitted. "And you know what? I think it did. Not in the way I expected, but in ways that matter. People are talking, Emma. Really talking. That's something, isn't it?" Emma nodded slowly, though her expression remained thoughtful. "It's something, but it's not enough. People are still divided. Some of the same arguments we heard that night are still happening, just louder and angrier now." Jack sighed. "You're right. But maybe the next step isn't mine to take. Maybe it's up to all of us." The next morning, Jack found a letter taped to the Dairy Queen's front door. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged, as though the writer had been hesitant or emotional while crafting it. "Dear Mr. Peterson," it began. "I was one of the people who protested your sign. I came to the town hall expecting to argue, but I left feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. I didn't agree with everything you said, but I respected the way you listened. It made me think about how quick I've been to judge others who don't see the world the way I do. Your courage reminded me that standing firm doesn't always mean shouting louder. Sometimes, it means being willing to hear what you don't want to hear. Thank you for reminding me of that. I hope we can all keep listening to each other, even when it's hard." Jack read the letter twice, then a third time, before carefully folding it and slipping it into his pocket. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. But the day wasn't over yet. Later that afternoon, as Jack was refilling the ice cream machine, he noticed a group of unfamiliar faces entering the store. They weren't the usual tourists or curiosity seekers. These were reporters, serious ones, from a national news outlet. They introduced themselves politely, explaining that they had heard about the town hall and wanted to do a feature story on how a small-town Dairy Queen had become a symbol of dialogue in a divided country. Jack hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to fan the flames of controversy further. But Emma, standing nearby, gave him an encouraging nod. "All right," Jack said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Let's talk." The interview was different from the quick sound bites he had given to local reporters. This time, the questions were deeper, probing not just into what had happened, but why it had mattered. Jack spoke candidly about Sarah, the inspiration behind the sign, and the lessons he had learned from the town hall. He didn't shy away from admitting his own mistakes or the challenges he still faced in trying to bridge divides. When the article was published a week later, it struck a chord far beyond the town. Readers from across the country wrote letters and emails to Jack, sharing their own stories of standing firm in their beliefs or finding common ground with those they disagreed with. Some letters were critical, but even those sparked meaningful discussions in the community. Meanwhile, Jack's Dairy Queen became more than just a fast food restaurant. It turned into a gathering place, where people felt safe to share their thoughts and stories. Jack and Emma started hosting monthly community nights, inviting local speakers, musicians, and storytellers to perform. These events weren't about taking sides, they were about finding connection, even in disagreement. One night, as Jack locked up after one such event, he paused to look at the new sign above the door. It no longer bore a controversial message. Instead, it simply read, "Welcome, all are heard here." Jack felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Emma standing beside him. "You did good, Dad," she said softly. "No," Jack replied, his voice filled with emotion. "We did good. All of us." The transformation of the Dairy Queen and the town wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were still disagreements, still challenges to overcome. But there was also a renewed sense of hope, a belief that, no matter how divided people might seem, there was always a way forward if they were willing to listen. As Jack turned off the lights and stepped into the cool night air, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: gratitude. For his wife's memory, for his daughter's support, and for a community that had proven stronger than its divisions. It wasn't just a story about a sign anymore. It was a story about resilience, courage, and the power of conversation to heal even the deepest wounds. And for Jack Peterson, that was more than enough.